The term that came to mind when you guys were talking about that was it's a great uprooting that's happening. And I think this is something that kind of happens from time to time during chaotic times in history. And it ends up dislocating people. And so there's all these people running around going, what is home? Can we bring it with us? Can we build it where we're going? What does that even look like? I don't know anymore because because we don't have where we came from anymore.
And we're back. Um, it's actually been 18 months since we did the last episode of this. And I feel like nowadays more and more I actually have to begin every show that I do with "and we're back." But it is great to be back with the panel of Parental Dadvisory for episode number 2. Officially episode number 2, although there was a...
Is it only two?
That's a story for maybe the end of this episode. We'll get into
I
that.
was going to say, we've done a couple of these, haven't we?
We've done... Well, there was one that we have that's in the can as well. And
big can.
You know, the saying around here lately has been that life happens. And I think that the next episode of Parental Dadvisory will be the life happens episode. Today's episode is actually about a question that's been on my mind ever since... Well, I think it's been on my mind actually for a couple years now, but especially since coming back from Hong Kong recently. And that question is, what is home? What makes a home a home? And I think with today's esteemed panel, we all have very unique experiences on this question of finding our home. So I think it'll make for a really good discussion. Who would like to begin?
Oh, is that the prompt? What is home? That's very broad.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, I do want to start with you, Encephalize.
Oh, okay.
Because you're the one who's made the most recent move.
Yeah, I suppose that's true.
So I guess my question for you is, well, have you found home? And then at what point did it become home for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I have actually. It's been interesting how quickly that transition felt like it happened. We moved very intentionally. Just to speak generally, we moved from the southwest to the southeast. Me and my wife and my several children. We went traveling and found a place that seemed good, and we very intentionally moved to a much smaller town. We lived in a fairly large city, and we moved to a very small town.
And that must have been difficult at first, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't. Speaking just for myself, I feel like I've always been fairly able to just sort of slot in wherever I go with the people that I meet. But the thing was that we immediately started meeting people in a way that we never did living in the city before. Neighbors would start introducing themselves and leaving little notes on the door, walking over from the next door to talk to you when you're out in the yard, whatever it is. And it just very quickly became connected in a way that I was never connected to the people that I lived near when I lived in a city. So
do you think that had more to do with your personality or the culture of the place that you moved to?
I think it's a better fit. So both. But it's the place. The city I lived in before had no real neighborhood life that to speak of. Just wasn't a thing.
I thought I had it muted.
You got home happening. That's right. You're still earlier, so yours are still awake. Mine are all asleep. But the city that I lived in, just it was just people living next to each other. There was hardly ever any sense of people really wanting to come out and talk to you or get to know their neighbors. And I lived all over that city, for a few years at a time here and a few years at a time there, and never got to know my neighbors to anywhere near the degree that I already know dozens of people in this town quite well. And I've also become quickly involved in local governance and that kind of stuff to a degree that just wouldn't be possible in a bigger city.
So would you say then that finding your place is kind of what made it home, or it was a big factor towards that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a reasonable thing to say.
Okay. Let's jump over to Rigomatic. Rigomatic, he speaks with an accent, so
Yes.
it seems like he's from a different place.
Yes.
Rig, how did you decide on establishing your home and laying down roots in Canada?
Well, it was funny. I was talking to my wife about this podcast leading up to it, saying that we were going to talk about home and why we chose the place that we did. She said, "Oh, it's really easy. We just picked a place that we could afford, that met our needs, and was going to meet our expected needs." I was like, "Yeah, that's pretty much it." And she said, "Well, that's going to be a very boring podcast then, because that's more or less the answer."
But this couldn't have been the only place that checked those boxes, right? There are many others.
Very practical approach.
I mean, my wife and I are very practical. So we moved into our current place in 2015. We've been relatively happy here ever since. And we knew we wanted to have kids. So we were living in a condo before. So we wanted to move to a house, standalone house with room to have at least 2 kids and in a neighborhood with parks and with an elementary school at least. Relatively close to public transport because we only have the one car and within our housing budget. Like we didn't want to pay a huge mortgage. So we got a moderate mortgage. But yeah, so that was that. To sort of tag team onto what Unselfwise was saying, the neighborhood that we ended up going with was one where my wife already had some friends in it. And I was hesitant to go with it to begin with, in the sense that if never had a falling out or something like that, kind of stuck living near them forever. And then we'd be screwed. But we're not like next door neighbors to them. So in that sense, it's fine. But the other thing that helped with that was they had been living in the neighborhood for at least 5 or 6 years before we moved in. So when we moved in, we kind of already moved into friends around the place. And yeah, as Jeff was pointing out, I do have an accent. I moved from Australia to Canada. So very far away from any family relations for myself. And my wife moved from Ontario to where we are in BC. So not very much family of hers is nearby as well. So it was good to move into a neighborhood where we had friends or friends that introduced us to other people in the neighborhood. And our neighborhood is a bit special compared to Jeff's in some sense. I'm not sure I was going to talk about it tonight. Whereas there is a community sort of theme because the neighborhood is an open land strata. So the parks and stuff are maintained by the strata. The buildings all have to look to a certain code and a certain size. So the buildings, like the houses, are never going to get torn down and built into ginormous houses that fit onto the exact plot of land, or a developer isn't going to come in and buy 3 houses and build something. Mm-hmm. The neighborhood is going to stay more or less the same as it has been since the early 80s, which is good and bad. And then the neighborhood itself also hosts like a Halloween party, Easter, Christmas things, all these things, which really brings the community together. And also the strata and the city have allowed it so we can host block parties. So there's at least 2 or 3 in the summer. And we close off huge sections of the road in our neighborhood and everyone comes out, brings out food and that sort of stuff. So all those things together sort of really makes our neighborhood and our home. It's really nice.
Yeah.
Something I gathered from that is because I imagine moving from Australia, initially, there must have been a time when you felt like you were a stranger in a strange land. But
yes,
given your description of your neighborhood, it seems that problem has been solved.
I would say it's been band-aided. It certainly hasn't been solved.
Okay.
There's still a lot of issues that I'm sure with you, Jeff, or anyone else that lives relatively close to family, you can palm off your kids to your family fairly easily if you need a break, whereas there's no palming off to anyone around here. So that's been a bit of a pain. I've been very envious of my sister, who's an hour's drive away from my parents in Australia. She can drop off her kid. Yeah. And they have a great time and you can relax. Or, if it was up to me, I'd probably do some cleaning or gardening or anything. But yeah, it has its downsides.
Every place does.
There's
nowhere that has none. But you hit on several things there that fit right in with what I was thinking about where I moved to, which is, one, we did know a family that had moved to this town ahead of time, which is how we knew about it at all. And they're, good friends of ours, so that's been nice. And then the community holiday thing is huge. The town comes out for Christmas and 4th of July and Halloween and, all the big community holidays. And there's kids everywhere and all the adults are involved with something, and it does make it feel like home because you see people out and about, and you run into people. And
yeah, there's something really beautiful about that. It's kind of like celebration together. It kind of reminds me of also being in a church community that every year we celebrate the various feast days and the various holy days, right? And it's like this opportunity to just kind of embrace one another.
Commune. Yeah.
Now, Laurentian, you're kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, where, if I'm correct, you've never actually moved away from your home, and you're actually third generation or so in the same locality.
Yeah, so we live in Ontario, in central Canada, and I'm the fourth generation in my home. So I've seen the various paint schemes change throughout my life. And, we've renovated the home over the generations. But we've been here on the same spot. We know everybody. We have the same neighbors for the most part. Some new additions to our village. Very, very small rural town. My wife is one of them. She moved from a farm down near Toronto. So she's moved up to where I am in Eastern Ontario.
Do you actually have friends who your parents were friends and then your grandparents were also friends?
Yeah, I think, well, that brings up an interesting point in that where I live and kind of our profession, our neighbors are our neighbors, and that's our relationship with our neighbors. But I'd say we all did activities together for several generations. Like we participated in sports together and remain in contact. So as, my dad had friends and our sons are all the same age and we all grew up together. So those relationships for the most part have been able to be maintained. But it's definitely a neighborly relationship that we have with people.
I'm hearing a little bit of reluctance there for you to call them friends.
Yeah, well, it's like I have it categorized in my mind as to what the relationships are with your neighbors and then what your relationships are for your friends. And the way I categorize it is you want to treat your neighbors differently than your friends in order to make that a successful long-term relationship.
Are you saying don't get too close to your neighbors?
Yeah, I think yes and no. I want to be able to depend on my neighbors, and I want to be able to communicate with my neighbors in my community, but I don't want to have them over for dinner.
So it's almost more of a business-like relationship.
Yeah. You're in the office together.
Well, yeah, I think, and there are reasons for that. And they're mostly my own reasons, not anybody else's. But yeah, just where it's definitely, I'm hearing a theme here too, where we live, it's in everybody's best interest to have as much distance as you possibly can because when you're driving by your when all you see is your neighbors and what they're doing, and the neighbors can see, of course, what you're doing, it's an easy topic of conversation to turn to personal. So that line between personal and neighborly becomes blurred.
I think you're hitting on a brand new right-wing concept, the friend-neighbor distinction.
The friend-neighbor, the Carl Schmitt long-lost essay.
Laurentian's friend-neighbor distinction. You're going to get it named after you, buddy. You're almost giving each other a sort of a sense of privacy out of courtesy, it sounds like.
That's a good way to put it.
Where you don't really have privacy, but you sort of maintain the illusion that you do.
That's a good way to put it. I know I can always depend on my neighbors. I can knock on their door. Just for tonight, for example, a neighbor's tree had blown over and I had my equipment in the area. So I went and pulled it out of the way. He's a young family. And we have lots of young families. That's another thing I should mention too, that we do have a lot of young families in the area, lots and lots of kids, and
That's
a good mix, and older people that have been here for generations as well. So we do have that relationship where you can knock on their door and ask for things, but to spend a whole lot of time, number one, I don't have a lot of time for social activities, but yeah, you have to be courteous as well as neighborly, and those two things can't be stressed enough, in my opinion.
it feels like it has elements of like extended family and business relationship at the same time.
Yeah, very much so. And it's a great community to live in. We really enjoy it, but you have to have, the popping in. I wouldn't do that, and I hope somebody else wouldn't unless it was an emergency. It's just not something that we do. But nonetheless, we do have some great relationships that we hope to maintain. And you're exactly right. Being courteous about it is respecting people's privacy is very important. But yeah, we have a great sense of home here. We have a great sense of home here. We've been here for a long time. The only other point I want to bring up is what stresses me out the most is how are we going to be able to maintain it? Because I will admit, there's other places that do look more appealing than where we are. But now those are in my moments of weakness. I reach out to Encephalized, and
yeah, we've talked.
When it's minus 30 here.
It was over the winter, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I didn't
minus
notice.
30 here. Other places look a lot better. I don't think I could ever lower myself to move to Vancouver, but
talk to me in the winter.
It's one of the things that I think about. Yeah, well, no, not Vancouver. The thing that I want to do is be able to maintain it and grow it, and that's getting ever more difficult, more and more as time goes on.
Because of the government, probably in large part, I imagine.
Well, I'll cap it off and say it's institutionally. It's not only the government. There's lots of other factors involved. But I want to hear from Jeff and where he's at, because he's got a broad sense of home as well, I'm sure.
Let me just put a pin in what you were talking about just now, which is continuity. But, to break from continuity, I'll just tell a little story about my recent experience. So I was just in Hong Kong for about 5 months. And Hong Kong used to always be this place where I thought it would be my backup place or my second home or something like that. Place that I could always return to. And the longest in my adult life I'd ever stayed in Hong Kong was maybe 2 months. Even then, I think in those 2 months, I would go traveling to other places for short trips. This 5-month period was the longest that I've ever stayed in Hong Kong. And one of the things that I sadly came to realize is that this is not my home. And maybe in a different circumstance, because I was there to take care, or my wife was there to take care of her dad, and I was kind of just tagging along. And maybe in a different set of circumstances, and given enough time, it could have become a home. But 5 months is a long time to spend away from home. And that's kind of one of the things that really made me want to discuss this topic. I'll give you a kind of canned answer for what is home, because, well, the first question that I asked my priest when I got back was actually if he had any insights on what makes a home a home. And he actually gave me 2 pretty interesting insights. The first is that everybody has a home or have a place where they consider a place of return, right? That is their home. And so the first thing he advised me was that if you have that place, don't be eager to leave, because that place is going to provide you context for the next place that you're looking into. Because this broad question of what is home can become very abstract. When we level it down to comparison, A-B comparison, it makes it much easier to kind of discern which place you actually belong to. That was the first insight. And the second insight he actually gave me was that you can also look at it this way, in that a church parish is a family of families. And so if you look at the structure inside a church, where the priest is serving as the leader in prayer and the rules giver and we in Orthodoxy we call it priest father, right?
I was going to say the father.
Yeah. And so on a fractal level, if a church is a family of families, then inside the family, the priest is actually the father, the dad at home, the patriarch. And so your home is where you serve. And so I found that to be the other missing element during my experience in Hong Kong, was that, like I said, I was kind of just tagging along, and we're staying at our in-laws' place, and I had lost all of my capacity really to serve as a patriarch.
You have no role.
Yeah, I didn't have that role, exactly.
Yeah.
Although there is something to be said about serving as a son as well, which is another thing. Although I'll spare you guys a lot of the details, but it was a difficult time, generally speaking. And as soon as I got back, There was an adjustment period, but I feel like I've definitely been more able to offer my service to the people around me as a friend, as a brother, as a father, and as a son.
So when you go to somebody else's house, you don't know where the cutlery is, right? Like you couldn't set the table. You need to ask for a little direction.
Yeah.
So you're unable to be useful in somebody else's house. So you know, what do? You sit around and chat, or you wander around aimlessly. You don't really have you're out of place. It's not your house.
Yeah.
You can't serve, you can't be useful,
Great analogy.
or as useful.
Yeah.
And you're looking to someone else for direction and a role rather than other people looking to you when you're not in your home.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is, like, I think my in-laws didn't really want to bother me too much with that kind of burden. They didn't want me. I don't know if they wanted me in the kitchen even, but that was one thing I could have done maybe. But everything else, they kind of just wanted me out of the way in a certain sense.
I've thought of that before, Jeff, that you brought it up. And I find myself, if I'm going to see a family member or something, what I'll do is I'll try and find I'll stir the soup or stir the gravy, or, you can always try and contribute and do something that's very small, maybe even out of character, or play with the kids, try and organize a game with other kids and stuff like that. There's always something you can do when you're out of your routine, or you're out of your place, right? When you're out of your house, you can always contribute to the activities. And the older I get, the more worrisome it becomes. When it's more stressful, I guess you could say. So I understand what you're saying.
Do you feel as though the older you've gotten, the more you are used to being responsible for things, and so the more out of sorts you feel when you don't have a defined set of responsibilities to be holding up?
Yeah, like you worry about things. You're nervous. Geez, is this in the right? You're in the right place. You become a slave to your environment, and if that environment is out of place, you're out of place.
Yeah. I was just thinking, it reminded me of times when I was maybe in my early 20s when I would go stay with family or friends, and I didn't feel obligated. If I had nothing to do, I could just sit around and enjoy the porch or whatever. And now if I go somewhere, I'm like, can I sweep your floor? Can I wash your dishes? Can I drive your kid to school? Can I do something? I can't just sit around not for very long. Go ahead, Rick.
Oh no, I was gonna say I certainly feel that, especially when I'm over at my in-laws' place. Before I was married to my wife, I visited them at least twice, and both of those times I was like, I need to do something. I need to at least sort of prove myself to this. This is super awkward. So there's like that huge amount of pressure, but also the feeling the need to do something. And then what Laurentian was saying as well, like we go over there now, just playing with the kids. I'm like, all right, at least we're doing something here. At least we're out of the way and providing some backdrop for everyone else to get along with that stuff.
And you know perfectly well as a parent yourself how helpful somebody playing with your kids is.
Oh, yeah.
That's huge.
What's really fun is trying to get my brother-in-law's kids who are teenagers or very nearly teenagers out to try and do something. I pride myself with embarrassing them. It's kind of funny.
Jeff, what you were just saying, and Rick both, about being awkward in someone else's home, I feel like is just as much a symptom of the breakdown of the traditional guest-host relationship, all these ritualized relationships that we used to have.
Right, yeah. And
those are, by and large, gone. They're a thing of the past now. And they really gave everybody patterns to navigate all these relationships with. And we have to make it all up as we go along now.
That's true, though I do find that some people still hold that way better than others. And I try to be assertive when I have guests over to make them feel like they have their place with whatever the activity is that we're doing.
Absolutely.
To me, it seems like it's to the expense of others. So I find it like a really hard balancing act on my end to sort of get everyone working towards something, if that makes sense. I don't know about you guys, but when I have people over, I love to cook for them. It's so much fun. But then I don't really have enough jobs to go around, so it's really awkward to get something going. So
yeah,
I think you're right that it is a bit of a degradation, but at the same time, it's still there. Like some of it still exists.
There are tattered remnants left, yes.
Yeah. This difficulty of navigating relationships reminds me of this question that I've been thinking about since last week. I had a little discussion on Discord, which is that we really live in this age where we don't know how to be authentic anymore because there's no clearly defined roadmap for that. So one of the things that I notice is that on the internet, we tend to be ruder or try to be more edgy boy than the next guy, right? We get into these interactions where we're not really being very authentic. But then again, when it comes to the real world, we're often overly polite. We go to the extreme on the other end, where there are a lot of topics that we might be thinking about that are not suitable for polite society. And so it's like we don't really have a lot of places nowadays where we can really be authentic.
There are no guardrails, so you're constantly having to improvise everything you do. And so you have a lack of regulation in one direction in the online world where you're just like no filter. And then you have over filter because you don't have any guardrails for what's appropriate with people in the real world either, right?
Yeah.
So you're afraid to offend people in the real world and you're totally not afraid to offend people in the other. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that very much relates to feeling at home.
Mm-hmm.
Part of feeling at home is this authenticity, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's cultures that handle that better. I think when Seth brings up rituals, like there are cultures that handle those things better. I think in my experience, the French are much more open than the English. And they're better to handle that with each other. Now, do they argue and can they be seen as rude? Yes, definitely.
But that's a shared expectation. So it's okay.
Everybody gets that that's the common culture amongst the French. Now, are they different, behave very differently with other French people than they do with us? 100%. But you can see the authenticity is a lot more. They're a lot more passionate than English would be. English are more trying to stay in their own lane. And like you said, kind of building those guardrails as you go along. At least some people are.
Did you know that Korean people, the first thing that they do when they meet one another is ask each other when they were born so they can establish who is the older and who's the elder and who's the younger.
And that's a ritual.
Yeah, and it's a ritual and it's like shaking hands. Why do we shake hands, right?
Right.
All of these things help put us at ease and to help us know how to navigate the social interactions.
They establish all these references.
They're freeing, even though, from a very liberal sense, these are all social constructs that are restricting, but actually they're freeing in their own way. Well,
and we all know perfectly well that that's nonsense. I mean, I think we're all well past the point of understanding that complete liberty is absolute chaos, and there's no actual freedom in libertinism, right?
Yeah.
But all of those things establish these little reference frames, and once you have the reference frame, you say, "Oh, I've met this man who's wearing a sport coat, and he got up when I came in the room and shook my hand, and introduced himself and his compatriots, and now I know where I am." Mm-hmm. Whereas you walk into a room full of Zoomers, and one or two of them look up from their phone like, "Bruh," and and you're like, "I don't know who anybody is. I don't know what's expected out of me here," and you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's the perpetual teenager, and
but once upon a time, even teenagers had manners.
Yeah, they had to be taught, and you're going to have to continually teach these people. Shake the hand, look them in the eye. How are you? That has to be taught. That ritual.
Oh, and it has to be not just taught, but enforced
and reinforced.
For a time. Yeah.
If all of us dads were in a room together, we could all teach and reinforce what a social norm is amongst us. Mm-hmm. But if we're walking into a room full of kids we've never seen before, or families we've never seen before, those rituals are a little more harder to sort out. But the underlying fabric of what to do is still there. You wouldn't be a completely authentic self all the time. Each of us would never enjoy each other's company ever again if you wanted to hear everything that was on my mind, unfortunately.
But actually, it introduces this layer of relativism. When there are no more social norms, when it's all chaos and we all have to navigate our way through, it becomes this will to power game. So one person doesn't like the social norms, then he has to reestablish his dominance at the top and say, no, we're going to play by these rules. And then it's always this constant competition. And, in that kind of world, I mean, we're reading for book club right now, The Idiot by Dostoevsky. We're seeing this kind of inability to be authentic because of these power games that are constantly being played. Everybody has to be guarded. Everybody has to protect what their true intentions are in order to engage in this Game of Thrones type of thing.
It's
And you
exhausting.
spend all your time changing masks.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're changing masks all the time instead of just wearing your face.
Yeah.
It's exhausting, and it's just finding that line, and those rituals that we've built or trying to build by being dads and teaching these things to our kids. And then, the good thing is that we have them reinforced on ourselves too, right? Because we're constantly reinforcing that behavior.
Yeah.
That actually ties back into the idea of what a home is. Another way of thinking about what a home is it's where you raise your children.
Mhm.
And it's the reference frame that your children grow up in.
Yeah.
If we want to use that same kind of analogy.
I really like how you keep using the word frame too. It's structure, right? You can't raise your children in this kind of chaotic primordial mass.
Probably because I've literally been framing a chicken coop for the last 5 days. I just have that word in my head.
Exactly. You can't raise chickens in the primordial mass
Yeah.
either.
No, that get eaten by foxes.
Oh.
I'm sure there's a political analogy there too, but I won't dive into it.
Something that I'm reminded of is also when I first started pondering this question of what is home was actually when the lockdowns started. Because at that point, even though I already knew that we were living in a kind of clown world type of place, it really hit hard when the lockdowns began. And this idea of, pod life and climate lockdowns and ESG scores and that kind of thing. And that's when I really didn't know if I was going to be able to continue navigating the world because it was looking like it was taking a drastic change.
Yeah. To riff off that a little bit, Jeff, on our first weave, I believe we shook hands. And I think you were the first person I'd shaken hands in a very long time. And that was around lockdowns starting and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember also, I think, when we met, I can't remember their names. Faced Man Jack or whatever his name was, and Laviosa, Frenchie, wasn't actually French. Anyways, both of them as well, they were astonished that we were shaking hands. And I'm like, yeah, this is it. This is our social structure for this group. It was good. But yeah, I agree with you. There was a lot more of a breakdown there. And to Laurentian's friends, neighbors distinction, the friends that I had in my neighborhood became more neighbors than friends over that lockdown period for sure. And I don't think it's going to really go back anytime soon. I like keeping the relationship a bit more professional than friendly, if that makes sense.
Well, let's take a poll here. Have you guys found that as you get older, your capacity for spending a lot of time with a lot of people has diminished? 'Cause I used to have a best friends circle of about 7 friends. Now it's down to me and my initial best friend from high school.
There are almost that many people in my house 24 hours a day.
Okay. And you're there 24 hours a day as well?
I'm home most of the time.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know. I get a pretty full helping of social interaction within my family pretty much every day.
You're kind of the resident extrovert among us, aren't you?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
Because you're
not at
meeting
all.
all your neighbors. You're spending 24 hours a day with your wife and your kids.
No, that's the thing. It's because of where I moved. I don't have to go out and organize things to see people now. It just happens because I live in this tiny place where I meet people that I know just going about my business. And that's really good for me because I'm not an extrovert. And introverts in cities now have this ability to just shut themselves off in their bug holes and like never actually get to meet anybody or know anybody on a meaningful way. And that's a real danger when you're an introvert, is that you won't be forced into social situations enough to actually make any friends or know anybody. And now my day-to-day life doesn't really allow that because I have people that sort of intrude on my space. And I don't mind that really, but it's not something that I would seek out naturally. But it's been good for me.
To riff off that a little bit. So I used to work in an office and have an hour and a half commute one way every day. So I didn't realize it before solely working from home that I had all these little relationships with people that I would see in public transport every day. We would chat, and then even at the office, talk to people, even if it was just at the water cooler sort of thing. And then I would organize to go out for lunch with teammates or even people from other companies that were nearby my office and all that sort of stuff. But then from working from home, really have to force these relationships with people that now live not very close to me. So yeah, I mean, I certainly have to force these things. And you're right, Jeff. My friends circle that I would hang out with has declined a lot over the last 2 years, but with things being less crazy, it's been picking up a little bit more again, which has been good. And yeah, I'm actively trying not to be the person living in the pod by myself. But
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, I wouldn't be because of people with wife and kids. But you know what I mean? Like, need to get out of the house and actually do things sometimes. Otherwise, I will go insane. So yeah.
My take is that I'm fairly isolated. Worked with my wife, with kids, of course, to spend as much time with them as possible, but very limited amount of interaction. And probably the best thing for me, because I try to be so courteous all the time, socializing for me is time I spend at book club or having conversations with different people online. So I didn't have that in my life for a long time until a couple years ago, until I started on Discord with you guys. So
It's been an honor and a pleasure.
my many thanks to you guys. But what it has helped me realize is that there is a value to online discourse, I guess you could call it, or discussions, that it has been valuable to me. And it has allowed me to understand the world around us. And I think the greatest thing that I've got out of it in socializing with people from further afield is I'm able to have a better idea of what risks are to my home or to my family, what real risks are. My risk assessment, I think, is a lot more grounded and balanced, which I don't think is everybody's experience when they go online, but that's been the process that I go through. And I sometimes fall off the wagon, but really just being able to understand the world around me and what the real threats are or what the real opportunities are, more so, have been a great exercise to me, because I wouldn't find that in a local social circle.
Wonder if that has to do with how small and local your natural circle actually is compared to a lot of us, because you do actually live in a village.
Yeah, it very well could be. Like, you can only have the same conversation about how bad the weather is 14 times a day before it gets a little stale. So it's the opposite of what everybody complains about going online. I feel more centered when I'm able to learn these things and develop my understanding of the world a little further.
Maybe another way to look at that is there's always this call to adventure that in every story and every myth, you know, the hero has the village, but he's called to grab something from outside and bring it home. Maybe online is your way of doing that.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assessment. And that's why I'm here again, to get a reflection back as to, you know, what I'm thinking or what's really going on.
And then in that hero's journey myth structure, there's also always a temptation for the hero to never return home. That would be kind of the negative side, the people who go online but then don't bring it home.
Well, I've always thought of starting an Instagram following, but I don't really think that's going to take off. So, but that could be a way, you know, of completely falling into an abstraction, is completely devoting yourself
That's
to
that Pajot video that we were watching recently about simulacra, that if you start living for the sake of posting online, the only reason you go to a restaurant is so that you can share it on Instagram, and you've kind of reversed the proper hierarchy of things.
You're more becoming the abstraction.
Yeah. So far we've talked a lot about relationships and people. So is it safe to conclude then that home has more to do with relationships and people than place? Or is there a part that place plays in it as well?
I'd say place is fairly important, because your place really attracts the people. Mm-hmm. That's why a village or a community is started originally. Some location being of value to a group of like-minded people, slowly grows from there. I'm sure Seth and Laurentian, you have similar sort of ideas.
And environment has to have an effect on some level, right? On how the people manifest themselves.
I was going to make a very similar point to Rig, which is that different environments attract different kinds of people.
Yeah. There you go.
And so if you move to a place where you feel very comfortable with the place as the place, you're probably more likely to run into more people who think a little bit like you and who were brought up a little bit like you, just because the people who are like you are the people who are also going to feel at home there.
Yeah.
And the place will have an effect on you. Like,
Absolutely.
you will change according to the place that you live. You know, I've seen that in my wife, how she's settled here and done quite well. So the place that you live, yeah, it can't be counted out. It's definitely, it becomes part of you. And then how you interact with the institutions that are in your place too is a big part of it,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
True.
Not quickly.
I can relate that to my experience in Hong Kong as well, where I think even now, I still think that Hong Kong, in terms of visual beauty, it's second to none. I still have that wanderlust when I think about going through the narrow streets, going through the alleys, the outdoor escalators, the overhead skywalks. But there is something to be said that aesthetics isn't just about beauty. Because if I were to say which city is more beautiful, I would say Hong Kong is more beautiful. But there's something about the experience of Vancouver that to me is just more
Cozy.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you say you find Hong Kong so beautiful, because to me, I mean, I've never been there, to be fair, and maybe it would be a different experience in person. But all the pictures I see just seem like it would be utterly overwhelming.
There is that. It's very much Michael Bay's Transformers, It'll hit you with every dazzling effect, but it isn't, I'm trying to think of a calming movie, but I can't right now.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't do well. I become overwhelmed if I have to go to a town of 10,000 people. I find that overwhelming. So I wouldn't do well. So I understand the stressfulness of that environment.
Yeah.
I'm sure I would like to go to Hong Kong one day, but I think maybe it's better just watching it on TV.
Well, you would go as a guest. I would consider it to be home, right?
It wouldn't be home, yeah.
Right.
My sense of human scale has totally shifted more towards the Laurentian side of things since moving. Cities feel overwhelming now. Not that I can't handle it, but it's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to be in a place where there are thousands of people that I don't know. It's just a completely different feeling of normal. And when you've lived somewhere as small as I live, which isn't even as small as where Laurentian lives, even for, it's been less than 2 years that I've been here. But my sense of what's normal for how many people should be around and how many of them I should know is completely different than what it used to be when I lived in a city.
One thing I will say about Hong Kong, though, is that even though it is a big city, it's actually very, very compartmentalized into neighborhoods. And you actually do run into a lot of the same people fairly regularly and happen to get to know a lot of people who live around you. I think I've mentioned this before. It's kind of like the little big village or something like that.
Yeah. I think that's a characteristic of healthy cities generally, that they have these sort of village pods. Yeah. They're like a string of villages rather than being some giant tumor.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have a caller on the line? Renegade from Ontario. You're live on the air. Or is he not there?
Does he have a mic?
Okay, maybe he's...
I can't hear him.
Computer problems, technical issues today. If you want to type your question...
We can edit that awkward segue out in post.
It's probably getting kept.
It's authenticity right there.
Yeah. Okay, here's the question. You guys covered it all. Okay. So with that said, do you guys think we've covered it all, or are there any other points to bring up?
Well, the only other thing I'd bring up, we covered the place, we've covered the people, but I think the one thing that I'd touch back on, what my wish is to see, is that continuity for our community and growth. And how do we do that? Because what we're seeing is, and what makes me nervous and want to move to Tennessee every 6 months, is that the institutions that we're having to deal with as young families are completely failing. We couldn't provide health for our children or ourselves barely for the last couple of years. Education has been under the same pressure, where there's no real direction as to what education even is anymore.
Right, because you actually built this stronghold. You built the Laurentian stronghold over 4 generations. And if suddenly you decide, I'm moving to BC next week, where does that go, right? You're kind of giving up the fortress, right? The stronghold.
Yeah, and that's, are you able to rebuild that again? It's not something that is considered likely, but it is possible. But am I going to have different results if I'm somewhere else? Like, is this rapid entropy that we're seeing occurring everywhere else? And the actual fact is, it is, is that we are seeing this entropy everywhere else. And there is more pressure on young families to provide for not only ourselves, but to provide for our communities. We don't have a lot of institutions that share the same values as our families, that we have no choice to interact with. So we all have a home, we all have a stronghold of where we're staying, but how do we continue on? How do we not only keep our families safe, but build our communities as well?
I have two answers that immediately come to mind. The first is the good Christian answer, and then the second is an example that I know about. That's a secular answer. So the good Christian answer is that the institution that has lasted for 2,000 years and continues to grow and is actually seeing, well, at least the Orthodox Church is seeing a blooming in North America right now.
Amen.
And so you don't have to build it yourself. You don't have to start from scratch, because Christianity has been here and it will continue to be here if we believe that promise. But the more secular answer is, I actually know that there's a guy here that I know who is, I can't remember which generation, but he was basically one of the first Chinese people to move to BC, his family. And they've managed to maintain that community, actually. The first Chinese settlers from China to Victoria, BC, they have an organization, and all the descendants are part of this network. And every Chinese New Year, they actually get together in one giant banquet hall. So it is possible to have this kind of continuity. It has to be a strong foundation that thing is built around. If not, people will kind of fall off.
Well, and that ties right into something that I think both you and Laurentian just hit on. Laurentian was talking about this entropy or disintegration that's happening everywhere. And it's like there's a flood rising and everyone's running for high ground. The term that came to mind when you guys were talking about that was, it's a great uprooting that's happening. And I think this is something that kind of happens from time to time during chaotic times in history. And it ends up dislocating people. And so there's all these people running around going, what is home? Can we bring it with us? Can we build it where we're going? What does that even look like? I don't know anymore, because because we don't have where we came from anymore. And so, Jeff, the people you're just talking about, they formed that sense of identity when they moved somewhere, right? And started anew.
Yeah. And
so that's what created that particular identity for them. And that particular kin group, right, was that they moved. And I think that's how tribes start. A group of people uproots and moves somewhere. And then they have to bind themselves together in some identity, otherwise they'll die. And that's happening 10,000 times over, it seems like, all over the Western world right now. People are moving like crazy all over. I mean, I know it's in the US, people are moving like crazy. A lot of them are moving to the parts of the country that I moved to for the same kind of reasons. And I've seen, a bunch of young families move in right behind us into the town that we moved into, which is great because, we've got kids that are coming in and families that should be able to hopefully set down roots now. They've been uprooted, they've uprooted themselves, but hopefully they'll start to grow back together. And I see that as something that's happened many times.
I can't really riff off your first answer, Jeff, but I'd say buttress your second one is to just aim lower. Like, we all know institutions are failing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can see the problem clearly. But yeah, I'd start off small. And I suppose this ties back to what you're saying, self-realized. If you have your house in order, as Mr. Peterson would say, you can then help organize within your own little community and maybe your business relationships with your neighbors and other like-minded people within your very small community can start helping to improve certain things. I joined my school's parents group, and that's been very good to get insight into what's going on there, and it's been very helpful for that. And just participating and being there and showing up every day at school with that family group and that is good. And I mean, if that's the most you can do to start to improve your home or your castle, your fortification, whatever you want to call it, then I think that's a good place to start. And then once you have that under control, figure out what the next step is.
Yeah.
Like, we've chosen our places fairly particularly. And I mean, I know I've had opportunities to move in the last little while, and I think so has Jeff, but it always comes back to the place that we're at. So we may as well make it the best we can.
Yeah.
Well, we have to learn a new set of rituals for our families, each other, our relationships, and the place that we live, how we interact with our neighbors and ourselves and our place. And then it's going to ultimately be up to us to be able to transfer these things onto our children and be able to teach them these things. And I think these kinds of forums and being able to discuss these ideas with one another has a lot of value in reinforcing the things that we intrinsically know. So it's a long road, but everybody's had to do it.
Yeah.
That also reminds me that, kids may resent their parents for certain things, but a lot of values are actually passed down through mimesis. When I moved to Malaysia when I was 9 years old, and I lived there for about 4 years, one of the things that we had was that my dad and his brothers, because they all lived in the same neighborhood, every weekend they would get together. All the families would get together and we would have dinners, large family gatherings. And one of the things that we've actually been emulating now as we entered that age is that me and my cousins, actually, the cousins who live here, we actually get together every Sunday for dinner.
Beautiful. If you find a tradition like that, don't drop it lightly.
Yeah.
You guys just made me think of Peterson. The flood's coming, and that's a bloody big problem. You gotta find your high ground. You gotta build your castle. Get it in order.
Well, he is Canadian. He does represent Canada, and he basically stole my bit. But anyway, most of his material is my material. So it's like old farmer wisdom is his gig.
Well, he grew up in Alberta, right?
Yep.
Like rural Alberta, yeah.
Very rural Alberta.
Yeah.
And I think we've all heard his wisdom before, and it is wisdom. It's good to have guys like that around and guys like that emerge.
Yeah.
Well, and you say we've all heard it before, and maybe we all have, but there are a lot of people who never had. Otherwise, he would not have risen the way he did.
And maybe you could look at it as a form of collective wisdom. So it's not just yours or his, right? It's all of us.
Well, and I'm sure he would agree, being a Jungian. That he was just expressing what's lurking in the collective consciousness, right?
Yeah. All right. Are we going to wrap it up here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said more than my piece.
Yeah, I think we hit everything.
Great.